What you'll hear on Patreon.
The opportunities that lie ahead will be absolutely massive, and this is why it's so important, I think, to really talk about abundance. Because it that is the incentive. That is the incentive. It's there's a world of possibilities that lie ahead because we can have a world where everybody has a very high standard of living and that opens up all sorts of opportunities. I'm Ted Reese, at Grossmanite on Twitter and Medium. I've got several books that I've written. First one was called Socialism or Extinction. That was self-published. Another one called Humanizing Production. Then Zero Books published my book on Henrik Grossman. And I have a new pamphlet coming out called Terminal Decline with everyday analysis.
Yeah, that's great. Everyday analysis is, of course, part of the broader Sublation media family. So it's really great to see that you're doing some work with them. Now, I've got a very varied listener base, viewer base, and not everybody's on board with the whole Marxism shtick. I wanted to start out by asking you, um, what is what is your relationship to capitalism or anti-capitalism? Because I think a lot of people come to anti-capitalism as like, capitalism is this terrible system. We need to overthrow it and start from the beginning. And sometimes when I will post things and I'll say, capitalism creates the future every day, I get a lot of flack and people saying, no, capitalism is a terrible system. But I'm not sure that you think the same way. You have a little bit more of a nuanced understanding of how capitalism works, even as a Marxist. Could you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, there's lots of things to complain about capitalism, and I would certainly rather we were living in a socialist system. But I think it's important to put everything in the fullest possible context, and a big part of that is historical context. And you know, ultimately, we're going through a historical process, and I think we have to really think in process-oriented ways about how capitalism is actually building socialism. It is laying the foundations for sound for socialism, and we'll go into why I think that is. And so yeah, ultimately, it's kind of birthing socialism. I don't think we could have skipped, like, to sort of abstract a little bit. I don't think we could have skipped from feudalism to socialism or something. Um, and there are forces that are independent of human will that are kind of building gradually. Um, you kind of have to put it in terms of evolution, like capitalism is kind of evolving towards socialism by becoming more productive. But at the same time, I get absolutely that that also means that capitalism is becoming a harder system to live within, making everyday life harder and more difficult for more and more people. But unfortunately, that's also kind of has the effect of that is kind of the necessary manifestation that has to occur to sort of draw people towards wanting and building towards a new system and fighting for a new system. Because if capitalism was all hunky dory and it was providing abundance and high living standards for everyone, there wouldn't be any reason to start building a new movement for socialism.
Yeah, I always find that funny how when it appeared as though capitalism, a lot of people had convinced themselves that capitalism had solved all of its problems, that crisis was a thing of the past. And you'd think, well, then let's just commit ourselves to piecemeal democratic reform. It seems to be the obvious answer if there's no necessary reason to overcome the system. And then you had people actually arguing, wow, the system's too good. It makes us too rich. It's bad for your soul. And I thought, God, of all the problems in the world, to overthrow an entire system because it's bad for your soul is just ludicrous. And that's part of the reason why I really enjoy your work and I really enjoy the work of Henrik Grossman in that it really brings out that part of Marx's work, which says this we are on a stage in human history and we're moving toward the potential for something else that is a necessity if we want to have um continue if we want to continue the good things that capitalism does give and make them better and avoid the destruction that comes with it within our current system. And it's not just like, oh, wouldn't it be great if there were like rainbows every day? It's quite a serious thing. So I wondered if you could give a little bit more insight into what you mentioned there. You said capitalism lays the foundation for communism. I know a lot of people don't like that idea. They'll point to letters that Marx wrote late in his life saying that Russia will miss this opportunity of they can just skip over capitalism and go straight to socialism and communism and so on. Marx Engels Correspondence, 1877, Marxist.org. Letter from Marx to editor of the Otyczny Zapiski. If Russia continues to pursue the path she has followed since 1861, she will lose the finest chance ever offered by history to a nation in order to undergo all the fatal vicissitudes of the capitalist regime. Marx Zasilich Correspondence, February-March 1881, the first draft. Historically very favorable to the preservation of the agricultural commune through its further development is the fact not only that it is contemporaneous with Western capitalist production and therefore able to acquire its fruits without bowing to its modus operandi, but also that it has survived the epoch when the capitalist system stood intact. Today, it finds that system, both in Western Europe and the United States, in conflict with the working masses, with science, and with the very productive forces which it generates. In short, in a crisis that will end through its own elimination, through the return of modern societies to a higher form of an archaic type of collective ownership and production. The historical situation of the Russian rural commune is without parallel. Alone in Europe, it has preserved itself not as scattered debris, but as the more or less dominant form of popular life spread over a vast empire. While it has in common land ownership, the natural basis of collective appropriation, its historical context, the contemporaneity of capitalist production, provides it with ready-made material conditions for huge-scale common labor. It is therefore able to incorporate the positive achievements of the capitalist system without having to pass under its harsh tribute. So they take this as evidence that Marx didn't think that capitalism was necessary. So how is capitalism a necessary step in humanity's pathway?
Well, to start with the end of the process, I mean, I think we have to, Marx was analyzing what was happening in his own time, but the reality is that the socialisms that we have had have either sort of been destroyed pretty quickly, or they have eventually collapsed in the case of the Soviet Union, or they've been heavily liberalized in the case of China, and probably you would even say that's starting to happen in Cuba now. So where are we today? We're sort of faced with this reality that it hasn't been possible to get rid of capitalism before it's exhausted itself as a historical mode of production. And, you know, it was driven to destroy the Soviet Union, not just because it disliked the Soviet Union or thought it was evil or saw it as a threat, an ideological threat, but capitalism needed to expand its labor base and the amount of labor it's exploiting, the amount of labor time it's exploiting in order to continue the process of capital accumulation. So now though, if we look at the way capitalism actually operates today, we see that it's actually more and more dependent on central planning, sort of within a corporate private enterprise, particularly the monopolistic kind. Um, if you look at the way it's gone under neoliberalism over the last 30, 40 years, they've eliminated internal markets. So there used to be a lot of companies used to have internal markets where the different departments of the companies would essentially compete against each other to sort of drive, use the drive of competition to get the best out of each other. But that just became more and more inefficient, and meant that the companies weren't maximizing their profit making potential. So that's one aspect of it. You know, and just to elaborate out a bit more, they're also more dependent on centralized databases because that decreases redundancy. Whereas obviously, if you have different databases that aren't part of one um, singular database, you get data replication and inefficiencies like that. You now have real time data tracking of stock control. That's real time planning. That's not even 5 year batch planning that the Soviet Union had. It's a far more efficient kind of planning that they have now. And obviously, that's a manifestation of technological advancements. So the other things. So I call capitalism at the moment. I would characterize it as an advanced state monopoly capitalism, or a decaying state monopoly capitalism. By that I mean that it's sorry, I want to just clarify that. So an increasingly centrally planned advanced state monopoly capitalism, which I think sets the stage if if we talk evolutionary phases for a centrally planned state monopoly socialism. So I'll explain what I mean by that. So it's increasingly dependent on central planning. It's increasingly dependent on state facilities because private R&D is increasingly unprofitable to operate. So it's shut down, and the private sector becomes increasingly dependent on state R&D. It's also increasingly dependent on state subsidies, whereby public funds are redirected into private funds, whether that's simply innovation or to prop up profit margins in various monopoly capitalist enterprises. And the system is also increasingly dependent on the monopolization of industries, and that goes across the board. So if you look at any sector, you'll see that there is an increasing integration of private companies through mergers and acquisitions, which are an important aspect of how every capitalist crisis, every sort of recession that we get, sort of on average every 10 years, is overcome. So historically, we're
Mm.
therefore we're heading towards a final merger, um, which would entail a public monopoly because an absolute monopoly could not be privately owned. Um, so I therefore argue that socialism is becoming an economic necessity for the first time. And I call it state monopoly socialism because I think it's important. Um, Again, going back to this sort of process oriented thinking, I think you cannot, I think history has sort of very clearly shown that you can't leap over stages and hope to get away with it, sort of thing. I think it'll come back to bite you. So, yes, there will be a higher phase of socialism or communism later where the state withers away, I think, but I don't think you can skip over that stage.
I interviewed Lee Phillips last week, and he was talking about a lot of the things that you touch on, which is, internal markets and the gradual realization that this was utterly disastrous, and the enormous amount of planning that goes on um, within farms. Now, all of that exists within a sea of prices. And is it possible to have this kind of monopoly, this final merger, without the price signals that ultimately make that possible. I mean, doesn't that just mess up the entire system? Are we not seeing something that just happens within capitalism because of the dynamics that are intrinsic to capitalism?
I think you mean that prices are rising and all that
Yeah, I
stuff?
mean, like, you can have Amazon, for instance, has a ton of is an extremely efficient planned economy, or Walmart, extremely efficient planned
Yeah.
economy the size of, a small country, really. But it is an island of socialism within a sea of prices and competition. That's what sends the signals to be so efficient. So if you don't have that competition, will you still be able to hold on to that developing socialist essence?
Well, I think the system's breaking down, like, and I think it's sort of it's going it's hard to articulate because it's to try and be as sort of holistic as possible, as dialectic as possible. It's the the crisis is forcing companies to sort of withhold or cut production and withhold distribution to force prices up to account for the to try and counter the falls in profitability that they're suffering. But I don't think that that is. I think the same driver is still continuing to drive the mergers and acquisitions that because that builds up the economies of scale and um, and sort of widens the company's capacity to produce, which would then they would hope bring prices down. You know, they are aiming to bring prices down again after a certain point in the crisis. But yeah, you can't have capitalism without competition. It just wouldn't work. You because you wouldn't have any if you have one monopoly, like one singular monopoly. There's no exchange. There's no
Mhm.
there's no one to exchange with, so there's no exchange value. That's what we say about socialism. It's whereas capitalism, we're producing use values and exchange values. Every commodity has a use value, a utility, and an exchange value, which represents the amount of labor time contained in it, more or less. Um, that's gone with socialism. It's a singular system of use value production. There's no like with two social enterprises trading, they're not actually exchanging goods because it's owned by the public. So there's no private exchange taking place. So that's why
Mhm.
you couldn't have a singular capitalist monopoly.
Right. So then if the system is breaking down, perhaps it's just breaking down and not becoming anything else, because the mechanism that makes the distribution work is the price mechanism. So if that starts to break down because of a lack of competition, isn't there just no way out of that? I mean, how does socialism overcome that issue?
Well, socialism overcomes it on its own terms because it doesn't need to make profit. So there would be no barrier because what's happening is capitalism is coming up against over accumulations of capital that are becoming greater over time. So as labor, which is the capital's exploitation of labor, the theft of its labor time is the source of exchange value and profit. But as that becomes sort of an inefficient amount is being created to reproduce and expand the value of capital, labor has to be augmented or replaced by innovation. So we see this increasing development or a sort of exponentially accelerating revolution in automated production, in commodity production. We're talking about. Um, so as that, so this is the paradox. The system needs to do that, but at the same time, it's removing the value creating part of the production process. So this goes through phases of increasing the amount of surplus value that's being produced, but at the tail end of each cycle, that exhausts itself, and you get back to the point where there's an inefficient amount of surplus value relative to the amount of capital value that needs to be reproduced and expanded. So you end up with a falling rate of profit, and then the system goes into a recession. So in the past, we've had partial breakdowns. Every recession represents a partial breakdown, but at some point we must, as automation continues to replace labor, we must head for a kind of absolute breakdown, and that does entail a class struggle. That does enforces a class struggle, because what the capitalists need to do to offset profits is, as well as replacing labor with automation, they need to attack the wages of the remaining laborers who work in commodity production. So this is going to get more intense with every recession that we have. And what one of the other things they do is obviously they cut production to raise prices. And at some point, this is all going to sort of snowball and manifest into a situation where the capitalist class, A, sort of becomes such a dwindling minority that it's on the verge of extinction, and B, just bites off more than it can chew, because it's putting too many people out of work, and attacking
So
wages
let me just
far too much.
sort of recap what the argument. So what you're saying is that you've basically kind of gone through the argument that capitalism creates a falling rate of profit, which it can be very complicated, but essentially, the reward relative to the cost of the investment gets smaller and smaller. So the incentive to invest in new production gets smaller and smaller. And people will say, "Oh, but now to produce things, you just need a laptop." Right. But even then, the rate of profit is so low that it doesn't even warrant the laptop, the investment in the laptop. Right. I mean, if you think about like information commodities, they're reproduced so easily, endlessly, that it's very hard to recoup your initial investment. And then, of course, you can talk about other aspects of production, like a shoe factory or something like that. As the prices come down and the cost of the factory and it's the organic composition of capital, the amount of machines in that factory are so expensive relative to the return. There's less and less incentive to invest. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly.
And
That's a lot
yeah,
clearer
so
way of
then
putting it.
so then this leads to a kind of some partial breakdowns that we see in crises, although the crisis itself may be triggered by all sorts of phenomena. If you dig down deep, why was there an incentive, for instance, to give people so much debt before the 2008 financial crisis? And the argument is, well, there were so few places for productive investment that you start to create these debt bubbles because,
Yeah.
why would you enter into production to create shoes or whatever when you can't be sure you're going to sell all those shoes and your rate of profit is so low? Why not just go give people debt? Why not, give students debt that they have to pay back? That sort of
Mhm.
thing starts to happen. But of course, the whole house of cards starts to fall down when there's not enough being produced to pay back those debts. Is that kind of where we
Exactly.
are?
Yeah.
Okay, so what happens then if we just do nothing? What happens if, the situation we have right now is there's not a whole lot of, class consciousness. There's not a lot of class solidarity. There's no organization. There was a clip that did the rounds on Twitter, on the internet, all over the place.
I think the problem that we've had is that we have people decided they didn't really want to work so much anymore through COVID, and that has had a massive issue on productivity. Tradies have definitely pulled back on productivity. They have been paid a lot to do not too much in the last few years, and we need to see that change. We need to see unemployment rise. Unemployment has to jump 40, 50% in my view. We need to see pain in the economy. We need to remind people that they work for the employer, not the other way around. I mean, there is there's been a systematic change where employees feel the employer is extremely lucky to have them, as opposed to the other way around. So it's a dynamic that has to change. We've got to kill that attitude, and that has to come through hurting the economy, which is what the whole global, the world is trying to do. The governments around the world are trying to increase unemployment to get that to some sort of normality. And we're seeing it. I think every employer now is seeing it. I mean, there is definitely massive layoffs going off. People might not be talking about it, but people are definitely laying people off, and we're starting to see less arrogance in the employment market, and that has to continue because that will cascade across the cost balance.
Yeah, and you could just imagine everyone in the audience being like, you know,
Yeah.
we know, but we don't say this part out loud.
Keep
So,
the
yeah,
mask on.
exactly. You're
Yeah.
supposed to say we need mental health support for the terrible economic, this sort of thing. But what happens if you have a capitalist class that becomes conscious or semi-conscious of itself and really has much more solidarity and is able to smash any kind of opposition? Um, what I'm getting at here is that the most common criticism is that when we talk about breakdown, we become economic determinists. Like, oh, we can just sit back and something new will come up. What happens if we don't do anything? What happens if our opposition is smashed? What do we do then?
Well, if the question is if the if the concept is that the opposition smashed, then capitalism survives. In which case, you have to ask why did it succeed, and what's the outcome? So the outcome's going to be, for the time being, capital will be able to continue, um, albeit at potentially a smaller, as the capitalist class will be able to continue as a ruling class, albeit maybe as a smaller portion of the population for the time being, and they might be able to increase the rate of profit for a time, um, by increasing the amount of exploitation, like, so by decreasing wages. So we might end up living off very, very low wages. But I think, like, looking at history, that sort of thing just incentivizes, you know, that sort of thing will build class consciousness among the working class. And I think we're getting to a stage where the state won't actually be able to pay the majority of its workers that it employs, which makes it harder for the capitalist class to enforce whatever it is it wants to enforce. So it's definitely it's a worthwhile question, because obviously, um, it does look like we're doing nothing as a class at the moment. Although I do think that's starting to change. I think, like, even in Britain, where it's kind of notorious, the Labour movement is kind of notoriously, sort of, I don't know what word to use without sort of having myself misinterpreted, but we're not the most militant in Britain, compared to other countries, compared to France and Chile and whatnot. But we've had the highest amount of strikes since the early 80s here in the last couple of years, so things are starting to change. But it's strikes for higher wages. It's not strikes to change the system. So, but it's interesting, like the wages they haven't quite kept up with the attacks on the wages, but they have largely been clawed back, which is quite interesting. It shows two things. It shows that the working class is organizing effectively to some extent, and it shows that the capitalist class has to expand the amount of labor it's exploiting, which therefore expands the amount of outlay on wages. So they have this is another contradiction. This is another problem they have. If they want to start reaccumulating, they actually have to start expanding the amount they spend on wages. So the whole thing's a process. It will never stop. History is not static. It just will not ever stop. Um, Obviously, there are other problems to overcome in terms of, you know, uh, the possibilities that could occur, that we can get into.
Interestingly, it seems to me they kind of realize the capitalist class kind of realizes that when you cut people's wages, you create conditions of instability. Um, and when you attack the working class, you create conditions of instability, obviously. At the beginning of this year, I remember I was listening to a bunch of podcasts from Davos, people reporting from their Politico podcast, that kind of thing. And one of the well-to-do businessmen there, billionaire, was saying, "Oh no, the next recession, we're not going to cut wages. We've realized we can't do that. The next recession will not see people um, having their salaries or whatever cut." And I found that very interesting because it seems to me they would not be able to do that. But do you see a kind of, I don't know, a glimmer of recognition there um, that workers can have the upper hand if they push too hard?
I think there's definitely like that within the saner parts of the capitalist class. That's certainly true, but he might also mean that we're not going to cut the wages of the people that we retain. It's just that
Yeah,
people who are thrown on the scrap heap of unemployment will lose their wages.
yeah, probably. Um, so, what does a surviving capitalism look like? Let's say that there's an all-out war, and the capitalist class just utterly sticks it to the working class, destroys all opposition, which is not particularly difficult to imagine because, as we've said, opposition is not that strong. It might be growing, but it's nothing like it has been in previous periods. So what does that? Where do we end up with? What do we end up with? Do we end up with something like a neo-feudalist system? What do you think of that thesis? Is that a possibility that we could, without, if we do not fight for progress, we can wind up with regress?
I mean, there'll certainly be a lot of regression as the system breaks down if it's not toppled and replaced beforehand. But it might, as I say, it might sort of take a lot of regression to sort of compel more and more people, or enough people, to s- to move towards socialism. So, but I wouldn't call it neo feudalism. I would just call it capitalism in decay. I think it's understandable that people are thinking about neo feudalism because, as I say, one of the things capitalism is doing is it's becoming more dependent on subsidies, but it's also becoming more dependent on rent. So, subscription models are going through the roof. We see them everywhere now. But that's unsustainable because you're effectively bleeding your customer base dry.
Mm.
You're eating into wages. So that's only going to work for so long. Subsidies can only subsidize capital for so long. The tax base isn't some sort of infinite bottomless reservoir. And ultimately, the relations of productions are breaking down into the relations of capitalist production are breaking down because a socialist economic technical basis of society is emerging, and it's this basis of automated production. The thing that defined feudalist production was a agricultural basis. The thing that defined capitalist production was a manufacturing basis, and the thing that defines socialism is an automated basis of production, broadly speaking. So one type of system starts to break down or starts to be replaced. So in feudalism, you had agriculture being usurped by manufacturing, and at a certain point, um, you know, things started to happen, such as workers moving away from farmland into the cities because the wages were higher and the freedoms were better. So that sort of thing started happening. Um, Feudal lords had to start selling their property because they came back from wars and they were so broke that they had no other option. So these are just the sort of manifestations that happen during the breakdown of a society. And I think to sort of hammer it home, like Marx's line that if there isn't a resolution, then you have absolute immiseration between the contending classes. I think that's a very good sort of political rhetorical line. But the Roman Empire, you know, ended in total collapse and immiseration, but
I was just thinking of that. Yeah.
it didn't stop the transition to feudalism. So I think, it is going to happen one way or another. It's just how bad is it going to get before we're able to persuade and mobilize enough people um, before that happens, and can we do it before it gets really really bad? I don't have the answer to that, but that's how you have to think about it.
The Roman Empire was the collapse of the Roman Empire and then the transition to feudalism was a regress, though, wasn't it?
It was regressive in some ways and progressive in other ways, but it you know did serfdom was progressive relative to slavery.
Hmm.
It was still a
Well,
form
that's
of slavery,
heartening.
but it was
Because I was thinking, like, well, you had the collapse of the Roman Empire, and then you had the Dark Ages. Like, we could have a Dark Age, but even from the Roman Empire to feudalism, there's a kind of progressive kernel, which is heartening to a certain extent.
that's the thing. You're like you can't sort of think this is the more the more I go into this, the less I'm sort of um I'm not like the more I think about this, the less I am anti-conservative and pro-progressive. I'm just processed, sort of process-based thinking. Like, what is the
Hmm.
process that we are going through independent of our own will? Like, and why is it happening? And so on and so forth. Because you can't really think in those binary terms anymore.
I mean, obviously, the process is God coming to know itself. But you can see, like, haunting this discussion is like Hegel in the background, right? This idea, but of course, it's humanity coming to know itself and becoming conscious of the process, right? It was so alienated from us for such a long time that it seems completely independent of human will. It appears like God's will, and now we come to know ourselves and all of these processes as human processes that we can, through the strength of reason, grasp and perhaps direct, which I think is quite a an optimistic message. And maybe just sticking on this optimistic message then for a moment, I want to go back to the idea of the system breaking down, what evidence you see for that, which I see, which is a big part of the pamphlet that you've written. But I feel like we never really allow ourselves to dream. And we're not supposed to really, because you can't create a blueprint for an ideal future world and erect that on reality. That's just not how history works. On the other hand, one of the things that made me the way that I am today was this. I always thought being a leftist was that you were a miserablest, that you complained about everything, that you complained about consumerism, banged on about how everybody had it too good and it was bad for them and it was destroying the planet and so on. And I had never heard, I hadn't read Marx yet, many years ago, and I had never heard an optimistic vision for the future. I had never understood that that there had existed and could be a movement for the future that was better, richer, freer than today. I had internalized this kind of like quasi-Christian socialism of punishment. And it doesn't have to be that way. And so, this awakened within me a latent love of space and Star Trek and so on. And I thought, well, maybe we could get to that world. So if we could allow ourselves to dream for a minute, what do you envision? So I asked you, what happens if we don't do anything? How do you envision a transition from from capitalism to socialism and maybe beyond? Um, if we do act, what is our best case scenario? Does the future or the pathway to the future look radically different from the present?
Visit patreon.com/Ashley A. Frawley for part 2.